Check, check, check. Do a quick thank you to all of our sponsors here today. Again, these events, as all of you, again, we're so used to these free, quote unquote, free events. Very famous saying, there is no such thing as a free lunch, despite the free lunch you all enjoyed today, that is actually paid for by our sponsors. So big shout out to TaxBit, to Hedera, the HBAR Foundation, and we'll be hearing from HBAR Foundation next. Ripple, Nature Wired, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, if I'm saying that correctly with my bad eyes, Algorand, Microsoft, Blockchain Times Climate, and GBBC, who is Houses, just as a reminder, Houses is our fiscal sponsor for BXC. Very big shout out to the GBBC team. So now we're gonna hop into our next chat. And this is somebody I'm very pleased to introduce. He's a friend of mine, a colleague, a fellow Web3 eco-warrior who's been working at the intersection of climate finance and Web3. You're going to be really enjoying here. We have a demo from Wes Geisenberger, the VP of Sustainability and ESG at the HBAR Foundation. Wes, could you join us on stage, please?
Cool. Thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate everyone from the GBBC team for having us, hosting us, Microsoft for hosting us here at this office. It's a fantastic location and a fantastic time to be in New York during Climate Week. For those who don't know me, my name is Wes Geisenberger. I help lead the Sustainable Impact Fund at the HBAR Foundation. And what we think about at the HBAR Foundation is growing the Hedera economy, but specifically in sustainability. So you heard from Nilmani, just by show of hands, who heard of Hedera before coming today? My goal is to double that next year, so this is just a test. And I'll probably do a couple more hand raise tests later on. But at the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund, our goal is to grow the sustainability economy on Hedera. And we think about that in the context of bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. But one important question is, why does this need a public ledger? Why is that important? And oftentimes we're thinking about environmental integrity of the assets that are issued, oftentimes carbon market assets. And in the Global Blockchain Business Council, we have a task force that's called the Interwork Alliance Sustainability Business Working Group. And inside of that working group is the Voluntary Ecological Markets Task Force. We've been working with like Microsoft, Gray's and Amy, and see on the authorship of these papers, working with folks like York, to help get these standards out there in collaboration with folks like the HBAR Foundation and our ecosystem of partners. And the goal is to enable not just a token to live on a balance sheet, but understanding the audit trail in the context of the methodologies and the rules. And a lot of the folks in our ecosystem are really, really focused on making sure that those rules are fully digital, auditable, and that auditable information becomes discoverable. The discoverable information then becomes trading information, and focusing on the audit trail first. And so when we invest in these public goods, we're building on standards that come from organizations like the GBBC and our Voluntary Ecological Markets Task Force, or the VEM as we call it, and we're building open source technology that acts as a rules engine. And this tool is called the Open Source Hedera Guardian. And we take our finance, our goals to support that mission, and we work with our ecosystem of partners to help make it happen through our grants. So we announced $100 million of funding back in 2022, and we support that open source infrastructure through our partners. So you see the name Hashgraph. Oftentimes you hear Hedera Hashgraph, but Hashgraph is also a technical organization that helps guide and advise folks building on Hedera. And working side by side with the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund team, and if Hanya and Jonathan want to raise your hands, just so folks see you and can identify you, we work together with those implementation partners like Envision, who are here in the rooms, if the Envision team could raise their hands. And those are the open source maintainers of the Guardian who work together so that these applications can build faster and they don't have to build the same back-end layers that are built again and again by emissions tracking applications, standards, or other software providers in the industry. It's a digital public good. And when folks build these digital public goods, the end users, who are often folks in communities, sometimes they're rural communities in the global south, sometimes they're large companies who are implementing environmental projects. And those are using these applications, and sometimes these applications are talking to other applications, but they're impacting the people on the ground. And they support the entire financial flow. So when we digitize methodology in the Hedera Guardian, which is something that you can do faster than any platform that we've seen to date, and these methodologies are all open source, you can trace the flow of finance into these accounts that are interacting with the roles defined in these methodologies on the public ledger. These methodologies, which are open source, you can import them on one click, are able to be used by standards. They're able to be validated by standards if you write them and propose them to the standard yourself. And the standards can look at them in Excel. Those same methodologies go in that rules engine, they can produce assets. And we're going to talk about that and show that in a little bit. But those same methodologies don't just have to be carbon markets or biodiversity credit methodologies. They can be emissions tracking methodologies to collect emissions data to meet the tough requirements that are coming down the pipe with CSRD, regulations in California, and other jurisdictions around the world. And the same folks who are getting used to the digital expertise required to develop these tools are working on both sides of the market. But they're also teaching folks how to understand what is granularly happening inside of these digital platforms so we can more credibly understand an important question, which is who said what when? Why did they say it? Answering what question and methodology? What calculation did it go through? What agency requires this? And so the Guardian effectively enables that. It's efficiently digitizing the rules, efficiently delivering the data from the different parties across a workflow, and ultimately cryptographically binding both the rules, which sometimes change year after year, version after version at a standard, or looking at not just a version, but maybe a migration to new rules across standards as we think about things happening in the carbon market, going from voluntary standards to, say, 6.2, or across different registries if you're looking to migrate your projects for certain reasons. They're cryptographically bound to a token, starting at 0 and adding up as that data enters so that you know what caused the issuance of an asset. And that enables a workflow across different parties made up of different schemas, which are just a series of questions and calculations that lead to the issuance of an asset. And we call these assets tokens. And those tokens are issued oftentimes as things like a verified unit from a specific standard or inside of a company. And the outcome is it's linked to the policy, and you can trace every single rule of who said what when. So what does this look like in practice? We're going to switch over to, it's a live demo, by the way, so if something doesn't load, it's live, so we'll find out. But this is a GCC, the Global Carbon Council policy, methodology. This is an ACM1 methodology. We actually got help, and I just want to say thank you to Masamba's team who actually helped validate and make sure that these methodologies were correct. And we can actually go inside one of these methodologies and see what's happening step by step by step. Now, because this is a Web3 application, because this is on a public ledger, anyone who writes these rules and publishes them to Hedera, anyone can see the rules. That means if somebody's not following the rules when they answer the questions, you can see it very granularly what it looks like. Now, this may look hard to read. We make this so that you can download these specific rules into an Excel sheet. It looks a little bit like this. And when you make a change, you can upload it right back up. You can even put example answers in here so that your users can pull this in and out, whether you're an emissions tracking platform or a standard, in the same format that they would expect from a project developer. And you can take this into schema by schema by schema. And schemas are relatively important here because if you go into what does a schema look like for one of these standards, they are extraordinarily complicated. And if you wanted to take a look at what a schema looks like, you can go click into one of these scenarios. I'm going to pull one that I've already downloaded a file to look at. But this is how an average carbon market schema looks like. If you have to read this in English, good luck. If you have to know what the calculation means in the context of the asset that was created half a year later, you probably have a PhD. So congratulations. But at the same time, we don't just need to know, and I want to point back to something we said in the last panel, that we're meeting the minimum standard. We have to go beyond the minimum standards. We have to put quality assignments on this, and this is where things like the ICVCM are attempting to put standards on raising the quality bars for what's happening inside these calculations. And if you go back to what these schemas may look like for, say, a monitoring report, which is this exact schema we were looking at here, how all of these data points are hierarchically related, we can actually take these IWA standards that we built, we've built into the rules engine, assigned to a schema, assigned to an overall methodology of many schemas, and we can make them searchable, comparable in ways that we haven't been able to do before. So this starts to become powerful building blocks, starting at the standards level, going into open source, building out a methodology and a rules engine that's now comparable one to another. And so say I want to go take these side by side. These are two different methodologies, and we picked these intentionally. GCC hasn't yet been signed off by the ICBCM for this methodology or the overall standard, but ACM1 actually has been. They've said that this is an okay technical credit methodology, and so we can compare them side by side. And so we could click on both of these, add them here, show them. Within less than a minute, in a live application, we can see how much of the same or different do these methodologies, how do they look like in a rules engine on the fly. So now that we can see the complexity of the depth of even one of those schemas, we can go look at them side by side across different standards to improve environmental integrity. And so when we think about this, why can't we do this beyond environmental integrity for every single SDG? It's possible. The technology is here today. It's open source. But what's also very powerful is I can go lay this out in very different formats. And this is what a schema looks like here. I can say who's interacting with the schema, who approved it. This is a gold standard water-related question that we search for in a monitoring report, but it's a TPDD tech, which is a cook stove methodology. And we can see who said what when. The project developer said something here. It's an application document, which led to a listing application, which led to a verification from the VVB, which was approved by, in this demo scenario, gold standard. This VVB application led to the project being created. That led to a validation. That led to a monitoring report. You can all search for this today on Hedera in plain English. That means every interface, every credit you want to search for, digitized down to that granular data point, is possible on the fly. And one of the tests that we always have is this technology objectively better than what we did in the past? Does it allow us to build new building blocks for innovation? Can we apply AI models to this? Can we apply other technologies to build on top of it? And so our next steps are, well, what's going to get us beyond quality? What's going to improve the market in part of these building blocks? And we have to make this all available in a programmable way. So all of this, everything that you've just seen, comparability, that hierarchical matrix, the search in plain text English is all accessible via API. If you run a marketplace, you can find every single one of these methodologies. If the project data has been input against it, you can search for it via API today on Hedera. And when we think about taking this back to, well, how does this apply to quantitative integrity? We can take that same Excel sheet view, and we can allow every project developer, every standard, every VVB to make sure that this matches their format, to iteratively upgrade it and expand their format for more details, to include things like the SDGs on top of just the environmental integrity elements. And we can start to map those to the aspirational labels that we create in the market, things like the CCPs, the core carbon principles, and we can map them to other attributes. But we do this, and I want to point out the importance of the GBBC and the IWA here, we do this based on the properties and the standards coming out at that low technical level that are the building blocks that we require for environmental integrity and industry success. And so what we've done is we've started to map that upwards because we have the schemas, because we have a workflow going left to right here of data points, and we know the data that's going to be collected and answering this from all the different parties, knowing who said what when, whether it's a sensor, a person, or a system. We can map upwards from a property, which is that glossary of terms that says across standards, this means the same thing, a monitoring report, permanence, durability, additionality, leakage. We can start to build statistics. And just by show of hands, who's a baseball fan or a soccer fan? So in baseball, I'm a Mets fan, so it's great to be in New York this week. If somebody has an at-bat and they hit the ball 30% of the time, that's a complex statistic to some other folks. It's just how many at-bats that we're taking on one side of the statistic, how many hits on the other side. We're doing one divided by the other. Why can't we do that in the carbon markets for quality standards? If you know if it hit the ball 30% of the time, it's a lot better than 20%. But what if we could apply that to qualitative, collected across every carbon market methodology? What if we could iteratively improve it to make it better? What if we could take this and map it all the way up to a CCP label, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? We can do that today on Hedera. We can go take, and this is something that's coming out in open source in the coming week or so, and we can build a report, select the different schemas, select the different questions in a methodology, select the different properties that map upwards to build those statistics and develop those statistics in a way that they're queryable, they're searchable, but not just the project developer or the standard can develop them, but anyone can develop our statistic on quality. How we engage different parties and not just technology developers to know who said is to put this in the hands of academics, NGOs, to say, here are the inputs, here's the outputs. How do I score this data? What is the relationship of this data to the data preceding it? This doesn't have to be done in a PDF. We can score it 1 through 4. We can score it 1 through 100, 5 stars. It doesn't matter what it is. Now, we've taken a real-world example to get here. And as we go across this, we work with a project developer called Alcott, who's been working on financial transparency metrics. We took a couple scoring categories of the CCPs, number 5 and number 7. One's focused on project effectiveness, and the other's focused on leakage. So 7 is leakage, and 5 is project effectiveness. What we've actually done is we've taken that statistic and developed it here so that we can map it into the CCPs. And what if you could take a monitoring report and all the data and show how that map of statistics to CCPs, what if you could pull that via API for every project? What if you could prove every single data point for all the projects that were just said, hey, you're not going to be labeled a certain way? What if we could allow them back in the room to take agency to say, or here's how I did it. Here's how I'm not being put in a category of not qualified to be bought, especially after millions of dollars have been invested into these projects. But that doesn't just have to be the CCPs getting a specific score on leakage or a specific score on effectiveness. That could be any label, not just a label developed by Fortune 500 companies, global north governments. That could be a label of what do I value as a community from a specific region in the world, focused on biodiversity, focused on any of the SDGs. We could give agency back to projects to build new attributes in the market, and those new attributes could be proposed by the same project developers, the same folks who are working on different standards. What if we could put the democratic control and access of what is quality back into the hands of folks who aren't just technical developers from a specific subset of the world? And those new attributes could be things like how much of the data comes from an IoT sensor, and a lot of folks here will focus on that, or a specific satellite data point. Back to the community, and could I prove it to a specific account on the public ledger, not just the percentage of money that went to the project developer, but what percent went to all the contractors, what percent went to the community, what percent went in kind to pay teachers or healthcare workers, versus what went in cash. These are all different financial attributes that we think can lead to a better market, and we encourage you to engage us in thinking about this, bring ideas, and lastly, we're a grant fund, so if you have an idea that you think can change the market, come to us, bring the idea, and help us change how the market works. Thank you.
Great. We have time for a couple of questions if anyone has questions. Great. That's all right. Here, I'm going to give you the mic so we can get the live stream to also hear.
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Alex Wick, the founder of Cascadia Carbon, and I'm wondering, how does your technology solve the self-attestation issue? The idea that, the data that's entered may not reflect real-world events or assets.
Could you repeat the question, Wes?
So the question, and Alex, keep me honest here to make sure I'm repeating it correctly, is how do we solve the self-attestation of data and understanding, I think, the who said what when part of what I was talking about. So the Hedera Guardian is a workflow engine, and I didn't really get into what the underlying base of that workflow is. It's a series of decentralized identifiers that are married one-to-one with accounts on Hedera, the public network, and they're issuing attestations in the form of verifiable credentials. And so when we are enabling those schemas, those policies, that digital methodology, what we're doing is we're taking the verifiable credentials bound to the decentralized identifiers all the way through what we call a trust chain. So every single data point is cryptographically bound via a verifiable presentation, which is a link of decentralized identifier or DIDs and verifiable credentials, all the way out to what we call a memo field and a token. So very technically, it's cryptographically tied to the asset issued from 0 through whatever number of issuances exists. And in the carbon emissions world, that's a fungible token. And for folks who want to join the carbon emissions token task force, feel free to reach out. There's some great work being done there. And for folks who are working on the voluntary ecological markets, that's often an NFT based on the standards.
Is that good? Great. We have one more question in the back.
Thank you. I have one question. I'm going to package it into three. No, it's pretty short, probably. I mean, one is the technology. Will it be able to actually answer all the questionnaires from CSRD, SFRD, etc.? Also, will it help with Scope 3 especially, which is kind of the complicated question always. But then maybe most importantly, you mentioned open source a lot. I see your foundation. I think Hedera is a for-profit company, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you can explain really what's the interest for you to making this all open source? What's the benefit for Hedera ultimately?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the last, and I'm going to work my way back. So Hedera gave a grant out to the HBAR Foundation to grow the sustainability economy. So you can think of us, we do our investment cycles with environmental due diligence first, technical due diligence second, business due diligence third. We focus on it that way because we need to do something objectively better for the sustainability economy than existed previously. We have to build open source software that solves problems for developers of applications and their end users. And what we're doing is we're basically doing work around economic development of the Hedera ecosystem. But at the same time, we're doing due diligence on applicants like a venture investor or an impact investor, probably a combination of both. And so when we're investing in open source infrastructure, we're investing in ways to use Hedera quicker, faster, and build applications that are better than what existed previously in the market. So that's the short of that first one, and I'm happy to come back to it. Anyone who wants to chat after, I'm happy to speak about our grant programs. Now, to focus on Scope 3 specifically, we don't have a total number of methodologies for not just Scope 3, but Scope 1, 2, or the 15 categories of Scope 3 in the world, not to mention product carbon footprints. We think it's over 10,000 methodologies, and that's a guess. For every single product, you could probably write a generic methodology, but you really got to get it down to how you collect a PCF and how those PCFs are referenced inside of Scope 3 across organizations. The really cool thing, and we helped define this in the Carbon Emissions Token Task Force, is we think we have an approach using a public ledger, and I think this is uniquely a public ledger solution, to reference both upstream and downstream Scope 3 emissions. Because when you digitize a methodology and you put it on a public ledger, you can show the operational controls of not just the project as it's set up for measurement, but you can also include the audit and show the digitized standard. You could even get that audited itself, in addition to the code base underlying it. But if you then say, I'm passing my emissions to a company downstream on an invoice tied to a product carbon footprint, you can show your allocation. At the same time, that company downstream or upstream can then reference your methodology, your factors, make sure that you did it the way that they can accept, especially if it crosses borders, you have to rationalize that. You can have the controls required to collect data and show your counterparties in your value chain exactly how those emissions were collected, how they were audited. And our theory is that you can carry the audit both upstream and downstream, working with the assurance providers, of course. You can't avoid the assurance providers when it comes to audit, especially under the regulations. When it comes to the submission, which will have to come in XBRL, the Guardian is all API accessible. The format of the data submitting can be taken from API and transformed. And that's something we're really excited to be working on and collaborating on in the future. And if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out because we're very interested in collaborators on that area.
Great. And we have one quick question here.
Hi, Wes. So my question is basically, especially when it comes to project development, around the certification, the third-party certification. Like, what systems do we have in place? Especially, I'm working with some women's cooperatives in India, and like the project development cycle, I feel like the third-party certification is a huge bottleneck. What the costs and the time associated with that process in terms of unlocking that climate financing. So what does Hedera have in place for basically checking that box or expediting that process?
So there's a couple ways we think about it. One is the Guardian's an open source tool where you can modularly create validation stages or verification stages. So in theory, if you're filling out forms instead of trying to understand PDFs and recreate those processes manually, submit a PDF digitally and hope it was correct, there's an efficiency gain there. But we also have invested in enabling technology to help inspect that data as it comes from source all the way through the process. And so we made a grant last year, Q4 last year, to a company called Demia. Demia helps inspect the source of the data and the percentage of data that may be direct from, say, a sensor, a satellite, and puts trust scores and annotations. Now, that work started with our governing council member, Dell, in a project they have called Project Alvarium, which is also an open source code base, to do trust annotations from source, whether it's a person, a server, or system, all the way through and showing if that data has been compromised. So that could be government grade or enterprise grade data. So we think about it in multiple levels of the open source stack. We have enabling tools in our ecosystems, and you can always buy this software, whether it's as a managed service or software as a service from parties in our ecosystem. You hear that folks like Dovu, Envision Blockchain has the managed Guardian service. There's marketplaces that sell the assets that come out of our ecosystem and help do different types of analysis on the pricing, like Toll Earth, who's here in the room as well. And we try to build an enabling ecosystem. So you say, well, the certification or verification is part of it, but it's also how quickly is somebody going to take to understand this asset and be able to sell it? Because ultimately, the majority of the finance is going to be through the sales of the asset itself. If you need debt financing for projects, folks like Evercity, who I think are here as well, will help set these projects up digitally so you don't have to transform into a digital format and go through the process. So we think about it at multiple levels, enabling tools, platforms you can use today, but also open source tools that you can build for tomorrow.
Great. Round of applause for Wes Geisenberger from Hedera Foundation, HBAR.
Thank you all.
Great.
And I also want to say one thing. A big thanks to Dave and the Loa Labs team. If you like the slides, they are not my artistry. These guys are fantastic. So
Thank you. We had a wonderful time working together. It was awesome.